Hello, class. My name is Forrest, and I'm here with my partners, Dominick and Nick. We are presenting our analysis of the virus on a network model in NetLogo. So what is the virus on a network model? Basically, what this shows us is an abstract model that demonstrates the spread of a generic virus through a network of nodes. And there are a few different ways that this can be interpreted, two of which are relevant for our situation. So the first is that the nodes can be interpreted as computers, and the virus is a computer virus spreading through the digital network, something that we'll be familiar with discussing as information science students. The other is something that we're familiar with as humans in our current situation, and the nodes can be representative of humans spreading and becoming infected with, say, a biological virus like COVID-19. So feel free to imagine this analysis from either perspective moving forward. So the first step that we took in our analysis of this model was to dig into each of the parameters that it offered. So first, we experimented with the number of nodes in the network. We used test runs of 100, 200, and 300 nodes. And we found that as the number of nodes increases, the amount of time it takes for the virus infection rate to peak decreases. This is likely an obvious situation of more nodes equals more connections equals more chances for the virus to spread and spread quickly. Another parameter that the model includes is the average degree for each node, or the number of nodes that each node is connected to. So we tested this parameter with average degrees of 3, 6, and 9. And we found that as the average node degree increases, the percentage of infected nodes drastically increases as well. And because infected nodes that recover have a chance to gain resistance, the percentage of resistant nodes also increases, and the percentage of susceptible nodes decreases. And we discovered that another parameter has a very similar effect on how the virus behaves in the model, and that's the virus spread chance. So again, as the chance that any given node becomes infected increases, the percentage of infected nodes drastically increases, of course. This has an identical effect on whether nodes gain resistance, all else being held constant. So the initial outbreak size parameter is a relatively simple one. As the initial outbreak size increases, there are more infected nodes to spread the virus, so the infections peak much more quickly than with a lower outbreak. And one of the more interesting parameters is the virus check frequency. So we found that as the virus check frequency increases, basically that just means how often a computer is checking itself, its status, whether it's infected or not, how often a person, is getting a COVID test, for example. So as that frequency increases, the percentage of nodes infected increases. When the virus check frequency is low, nodes might not be checking their state often enough to register that they're actually infected. And by the time they do check, they're no longer infected. So this leads to an underestimation of infections, whereby increasing the intervals at which they check leads to a more accurate picture of the infection rate. And then lastly, we analyzed the recovery chance parameter. As the recovery chance for infected nodes increases, the number of susceptible nodes increases because a recovered node will become susceptible again, with the exception of nodes that gain resistance, which is a very small number, around 5% in the original model.
So one of the other things that we tried to do was setting the gain resistance chance to 0%. And we noticed that at the beginning of the test, both types, the infected and susceptible, both start at opposite ends of the graph and then rapidly change places. And after each crosses the 50% line, each kind of plateaus, but in a very unstable way. And the other interesting part of this test is that it appears to run forever. So it also asks if it could live forever as long as the chance of recovery is over 0. And the graph that we have here shows a resistance rate of 0, a high spread rate, and a 5% recovery rate. Now, it appears that the virus can live forever if there are enough hosts, a low rate of recovery, and a high chance of spreading. And it's almost impossible for the node not to get infected again. Now, the virus can still die out even with a resistance rate of 0 if the rate of recovery is high enough. The virus is unable to infect enough nodes before dying out. In this case, the above graph has a recovery rate of 6.5%. Now, with this one, it runs forever, but it appears that any graph with a recovery chance of 6.5% or greater has a really good chance of dying out. And as you can see in this graph, there were several points where it almost reached 100% recovery and died out entirely. When I set the recovery rate to 10%, it was interesting. The network recovered almost immediately. So it always has a better chance of dying if the recovery chance is higher.
Now we'll look at extending the model. As we know from COVID-19, viruses have the ability to mutate and spread different variants. Similarly, a network virus can do the same thing. The rate at which nodes become infected with the mutant virus would be higher than the original strain because nodes that are resistant to one strain of the virus will not be resistant to the others. Given the nodes in our model become immune to the original virus, we believe that different variants of the virus would lead to more infections overall. Another insight we thought of is the network check frequency's relation to detecting different strains of the virus. While the infections may increase, the model may not show as much of an increase because it cannot accurately detect the new strain. One thing we feel is missing from the model is the variance of gaining resistance between each individual node. In this model, each node has the exact same chance of gaining resistance, which is not realistic in a real network. For example, some nodes would have a higher chance of gaining resistance than others based on the characteristics of that node. Furthermore, in a real network, each node would have a different percentage of becoming infected in the first place for the same reasons. As a thought experiment, we decided to examine how the model might change if we were modeling the spread of an idea rather than a disease. One thing we would change in this model would be that some nodes have the ability to start out resistant to the idea because simply they do not agree with it. In other words, since the node would have the ability to be resistant to the idea by choice, some nodes in the network would be resistant before the simulation even begins. We could implement this change by creating a parameter that allowed a percentage of nodes to start resistant.
And that wraps up our analysis of the virus on a network model.